Alright everyone, I'm back with another review video of the new Mizuno Golf JPX921 irons. In my last video, I hit the tour head, the forged head and the hot metal head in TrackMan to see what model produced the best numbers for me. And in that test, the winner was actually the JPX921 forged head. But in today's video, I'm gonna move off the mat in the hitting bay to hit all the models off grass to test something called turf interaction. That's a very fancy word, you might think, but it literally just means how well the club head moves through the turf. And it's very important. It could affect both launch, spin rate, ball speed, and the overall feel for the player. So let's get these bad boys out to the range, and I'm going to explain just a little bit more about turf interaction. So the biggest design feature that will affect turf interaction has to do with the width of the sole. If you compare the hot metal head to the tour head, you can see that the hot metal head has a much wider, thicker sole compared to the tour head. If you have a wider sole, the club is going to dig less into the turf and glide more on top of it, compared to when you have a much thinner, narrower sole that will cause the club to dig into the turf a touch more. What sole type that might be the best for you is something that you have to figure out. Most tour players prefer a narrower sole that digs a little bit more into the turf to allow them to really hit down at the golf ball, compress the ball, and then swing it through the turf. This requires a little bit more timing. You can't bottom out too far behind the ball because of the fact that the club will tend to dig more. But it will also allow the club to move through the turf easier. If you're an amateur, and most amateurs probably should, play with a wider sole because you don't have to be as exact in your low point control. Another important factor to consider when you test the turf interaction is the firmness of the surface that you normally play on. If you tend to play on very firm conditions, you definitely want a narrower sole and a little sharper leading edge to allow that club to not bounce too much through the turf, but instead get into the turf so you can really get to the ball. But if you play on softer conditions like the majority of golfers do, including myself, you want a little wider sole and a little more rounded leading edge to avoid that club to dig too deep into the turf. Personally, I play mostly on soft conditions and I have a little steeper attack angle because I like to hit that little squeeze fade with my irons. So a little wider sole might be the best for me, but I do play tournaments in firmer conditions, so I have to have a sole that can perform both on soft and firm conditions. So most likely I would end up in the middle, exactly where the forged model is, but let's go to the range and give them all a go. Alright guys, before I start hitting, I just want to give a shout out to Mizuno Europe, who sent me their fall collection of clothing. If you're playing golf in the colder months, then check this collection out. It will definitely help you keep warm. Okay, let's start out with the tour model, and we got a pitching wedge, 7-iron and 4-iron here. So I'm gonna start out with a pitching wedge. We need balls. All right, let's give these a go. Felt good. Went through the turf really easy, but it didn't dig too much, so that's really good. That's a pretty narrow sole. Yeah, that's nice. It's real nice. 7-iron. Go a little steep on that one. Yeah, if you get steep with these, they're definitely gonna dig more. All right. this hot metal club comes out like an absolute rocket. Alright guys, just got done hitting the 3 different models, the forged head, the tour head and the hot metal head, and the one model that I felt moved through the turf the best was the JPX921 forged iron. So once again, this is the test winner for me. What I really liked about this model is that it has a slightly wider sole, which allowed me to not dig the club too deep into the turf, but I was still able to get to the ball without having the club bounce too much. The majority of the courses that I play on has softer conditions, which allows me to play a little bit of a wider sole. The JPX tour head worked pretty good, but when I came up to a 4-iron, it was just too thin and narrow, and the club tend to dig a little bit too much for my liking. And if you compare that to the hot metal head, that sole was almost too thick. I couldn't really get to the ball with the 4-iron. I felt like I had to be almost a lot more shallow to really pick the ball clean instead of getting the club into the turf, because when I was more aggressive into the turf, I felt like the club kind of bounced. So that caused me to be too shallow with the longer irons, which produce more of a draw to me, or a hook that I hate to hit. So I want to be able to feel like I can get more down on the golf ball without risking that club to bounce too much, so I can hit that little fade that I like. So super important guys, if you have the opportunity, test your irons off grass to see how they move through the turf. It's mostly a feel thing, but sometimes the feel can produce a different outcome or a different swing feel, like it did with the longer irons for me. So then it can actually change your performance. So give it a go guys. Test them off grass if you can. I hope you like this review. If you haven't already, go check out the Mizuno JPX models. I like all of them. But for me, as of right now, the JPX921 forged head is the test winner.